It may be said of his reputation that it is based upon and measured by the strength of his originality and boldness as an irreverent innovator, rather than upon the real penetrating value of his work. To this assertion there are exceptions in the history of art of known exceptionalism, so it is with John Sargent. Sometimes from out of the depths of their enigmatic imaginations and methods there comes a simple manifestation of straightforward individualism that all can understand. So it is that while Carolus Duran aided in his formulation and foundation, it was within the artist to muster all the energy and self-assuredness that made him a standout from the start. Through his canvases and distinct preferences, it is in a vein quite the artist's own. On holiday, we look at Sargent summers of leaving the confines of the studio and the obligations of portrait schedules to emerge for a fresh and needful change, to venture out and rekindle the mind to observe and record with a renewed excitement, sometimes with friends, but more often with family, all of whom were ready models at a given moment to seize a given opportunity and record in paint. Sargent would go wherever his eye led him and choose his subject. Life was plain sailing on a sea of summer. He would breakfast at 7:30 and then venture out to sketch, working till the light failed. His energy was inexhaustible, the hours of sunshine were treasured like gold. We are given an account by Miss Heinemann of his advice to her regarding her own pictures.
"Paint 100 studies," he would say. "Keep any number of clean canvases ready, of all shapes and sizes, so that you are never held back by the sudden need of one. You can't do sketches enough. Sketch everything and keep your curiosity fresh." He thought it was excellent practice to paint flowers, for the precision necessary in the study of their forms and the pure brilliancy of their colour. It refreshed the tone of one's indoor portraits, he insisted, to paint landscapes or figures out of doors, as well as to change one's medium now and then. He disliked pastel. It seemed to him too artificial, or else it was made to look like oil or watercolour, and in that case why not use oil or watercolour? His general remarks were, "Cultivate an ever-continuous power of observation. Wherever you are, be always ready to make slight notes of postures, groups, and incidents. Store up in the mind without ceasing a continuous stream of observations from which to make selections later. Above all things get abroad, see the sunlight, and everything that is to be seen, the power of selection will follow. Be continually making mental notes, make them again and again, and test what you remember by sketches till you have got them fixed. Do not be backward at using every device and making every experiment that ingenuity can devise, in order to attain that sense of completeness which nature so beautifully provides, always bearing in mind the limitations of the materials in which you work."
We typically think of John Singer Sargent as a citizen of the world, and his brilliant watercolours, many depicting exotic locales, attest to that. He was born in Florence, Italy, in 1856, to an expatriate Philadelphia surgeon father, who was also a skilled medical illustrator, and a Boston heiress mother who enjoyed watercolours and a passion for Europe. Growing up, he lived all over Europe, France, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany. Sargent spoke 4 languages and studied art in Florence, Dresden, Berlin, and Paris. He considered himself an American, but it wasn't until he was 17 that he actually stepped foot in the United States. But when he did visit America, he considered Boston, and especially the Back Bay, his home. Sightseeing was reserved for rainy days. In the evenings he would play chess, or the piano where one was available, duets with Mrs. de Glen or Miss Eliza Wedgwood from Brahms, Schumann, or Albanese. "The only pleasure," he wrote, "of coming back to one's own house is the pleasure of unpacking the bibelots or ornaments one has got elsewhere. Good, wholesome sentiments." From his earliest days he was out from the studio and painting landscapes and whatever fancied him. Apart from Carolus Duran's studio, Sargent demonstrated his skills in the beach scene of the Oyster Gatherers, which was a hit at the Salon, much to Duran's delight. Not an easy task for a youth to gain such praise. His studies alone are remarkable and freshly conceived. Sargent was a determined draughtsman as well, taking additional classes with Yvonne and Bonnat at the École des Beaux-Arts evenings. It was necessary for Duran's pupils to already have drawing skills in place before entering his studio. He was as precocious at out-of-door colour as he was doing figure work and portraiture in the confines of the studio, where the light is controlled and much easier to define. In 1878, Sargent would make his way to Capri, and we have his model Rosina Ferrara posing resting against a tree, and two other remarkable figure pieces about the same time. One is head of a girl, and another painting of Rosina smiling with hand on her hip. The delicate colour harmony and economy of means were becoming more and more a trademark of his paint handling, as also with the Man in Reverie, a dark-haired model very firmly placed against a white wall and draped with a black garment to a striking effect of tones. A couple of years later, in 1882, Sargent would head south, where we find his remarkable Venetian pictures, using the more romantic depictions of young men and women on the streets, again with the deeper tones expressing the mood and character of the alleyways, making use of contemporary subject matter. Sargent frequented with artist friends who were ready models to pose as the opportunity provided. In between his busy portrait schedule, Sargent is as active as ever in his plein-air work. We begin to see him working with the Vickers family and individual portraits of members which included the Mrs. Vickers, daughters, and the beginnings of Carnation, Lily Rose. Sargent stayed with artist Francis David Millet at Farmhouse in Broadway, Worcestershire, and there he began working on the painting. This time the young models are Dorothy and Polly Barnard. Sargent's progress was slow. He worked on the painting from September 1885 and completed it sometime in October 1886. Earlier sketches were made of two younger children, as they posed near lilies potted about the garden, water pitcher in hands. The greens are rich with the fading light of early evening, the glowing whites of the flowers especially crisp and dotted about the composition. As the year is expended, Sargent is back, and the theme takes on new energy with Dorothy Barnard, as she is with an oriental lantern about to be lit, and in the same garden area. The many studies and sketches Sargent produces over this project make it evident that he wants it to become something very worthy. The painting is held over the winter in a barn until the following year, and he returns to it with the same enthusiasm, as one artist friend witnesses that the painting each night is scraped to the bone so as to keep the shapes and thick paint globs under control for the next day's effort. The result is one of great impact, with bright, clean tones, with violet traces of colour pervading as the evening light is captured in true fashion. In 1891, Sargent made a journey to Egypt and Greece for the purpose of studying the ancient pictorial and relief conceptions of the gods and goddesses of idolatry and polytheism. Neith, Pharaoh, the Assyrian king, Pasht, the Sphinx, Osiris, and many others that were to be introduced in the lunette and ceiling at the north end of the hall in the Boston Library. This was the first part of the series of mural paintings illustrating the history of the Jewish and Christian religions. It was upon the visit to America Sargent and Edwin Abbey were greeted in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, where the cities were doing honor to both Sargent and Abbey. It was at this time the buzz was being circulated about a mural project, with discussions concerning general topics. Sargent took advantage during the visit to paint the celebrated picture of Carmencita, a popular Spanish dancer, which he later sent to the exhibition of the Society of American Artists in New York, and which was later bought by the French government for the Luxembourg Museum. With a decision made, the trustees of the Boston Public Library commissioned Sargent and Abbey to paint the mural decorations for two of the principal rooms of the great monumental library, which had just been erected in Copley Square from the designs of architects McKim, Mead, and White. Returning to England, the two artists plotted with their minds full of projects for the important public commission which opened up. From this time forth, a large part of Sargent's attention and energy were dedicated to the mural work. While he was in Egypt and Greece, he made a number of good sketches and studies, including the full-length nude study of an Egyptian girl which he sent to the exhibition of the New English Art Club in 1892, and he also made sketches of a Fella woman. Following that we have the painting of a Bedouin Arab, then the Temple of Dendera, and finally the group of Egyptian indigo dyers. In 1902 Sargent spent the month of August in Norway. There he painted On His Holidays, a salmon river tumbling with agitated waters through a rocky channel, and a portrait of young McCulloch, lying on one of the rocks beside the salmon he had caught. The picture is brilliant and has the chilling accuracy of real life. It is a plain, unvarnished and honest portrayal, told in the cold northern light, the pinkish skin tones arranged carefully juxtaposed on the canvas, in such a way that it brings warmth to the overall colour scheme, a work of an accomplished craftsman who has the colouring carefully thought out and true. Hostilities were brewing, and suddenly there was a concern over the artist. John Singer Sargent, the painter, is somewhere in Austria, 1914, and his friends are greatly worried as to his safety. He was last heard from on August 4th. Mr. Sargent had been painting in the Tyrol. He was accompanied by Major Armstrong, an Englishman. It is believed probable that he has been detained by the Austrian military authorities and not permitted to return to England. When the exile returned in due time to London, he brought with him some of the strangest-looking pictures while detained he had ever painted. Strangest of all were the Tyrolese crucifix and the Tyrolese graveyard. Less odd but more profound is the painting of the Tyrolese interior, a group of folks around a table in a despairing mood, perhaps the news of war no one wanted to see. But the painting, now in the Metropolitan Museum, New York, is a touching work. And by far the most pleasing to look upon was Master and Pupils, a poetic and intimate portrayal of a master teaching students in the open air, and now owned by the Boston Art Museum, which is conceived in an entirely different mood and carried to a finer degree of finish. In 1916, Sargent departs from Europe for a summer vacation trip to the Canadian Rocky Mountain region. Avoiding the army of tourists at Banff and Lake Louise, Sargent found his way to a retired camp on the banks of Lake O'Hara, far from the madding crowd, and there it was that he painted his gloriously beautiful landscape, Lake O'Hara. He began to paint this picture on a grey day, when the scene was very impressive, but before he had got very far with it, there was a change in the weather, and the clouds rolled away. He changed his mind and made it an effect of sunshine, but then a spell of bad weather intervened, interrupting the work. But when the sun finally made its reappearance, he was able to finish the picture. During stormy weather, he made a watercolour sketch of the subject again as a grey day effect. Sargent's sojourn at the Lake O'Hara camp is further commemorated in several other excellent pictures of tents, which give an interesting idea of the kind of place the camp was, and the gusto with which the painter responded to the call of the wilderness. Then we have Two Girls Fishing, now in the Cincinnati Art Museum, providing us a glimpse of the small gathering of close associates Sargent enjoyed amidst the beautiful Canadian Rockies. To these tours through Europe and in America, or the Canadian backcountry in his chosen company, he owed some of the happiest months of his life. He was away from portraits, which by 1909 had become wearisome to him. As early as 1906 he had written to Lady Lewis, "I have now got a bomb-proof shelter into which I retire when I sniff the coming portrait or its trajectory." Sargent was free to paint whatever moved him, and with family and friends he had all he required for a full life, albeit as time went on he withdrew from others, as his inner circle became tighter, which was needful. His portrait drawings were the replacement for oil portraits in which the demands of clients with preferences of their own became burdensome. Sargent would declare, "Whenever I do a portrait, I lose a friend." However, his admirers were many, as wrote Professor Phelps. One is justified in predicting immortality for these compositions. Sargent belongs among the great portrait painters of all time, his pictures revealing the mysterious but unmistakable stamp of genius. In fact, everything he does shows this quality, which makes his painting the envy of competitors and the pride and glory of American art. From 1917 to 1925, Sargent needed larger studio space in order to execute his colonnade murals for the new Art Museum on Huntington Avenue. So, he rented a studio of his own at the Pope Building, which is across the street from Back Bay Station. There, and at his London studio as well, he produced 8 paintings, 12 reliefs, and lots of architectural ornament, all made of plaster. Instead of painting fresco style directly onto wet plaster, Sargent created monumental oil paintings, and the canvases were adhered to the walls. He planned to oversee the final installation, but unfortunately passed away suddenly on April 14, 1925, on the eve of his departure for Boston from England. His elaborate work was unveiled posthumously to great acclaim at the Museum of Art in 1925. Now to turn to another aspect of Sargent, it is his generous interest in the work of his fellow artists that has been mentioned. It was often manifested both in England and America, but his friendly aid and encouragement were sedulously kept from the public. Frank Tompkins was one of the painters occupying studios in the Columbus Avenue building where Sargent had his workrooms for 8 or 10 years in Boston, and once in a while, when Tompkins' door stood open or partly open, Sargent would drop in for a few minutes to look over his neighbour's work, and, if requested to do so, to criticize it. Shortly after one of these friendly calls, Tompkins was surprised by an unexpected visit from a representative of the Boston Art Museum, who asked to be shown a certain painting of a mother and child. A few days later, the picture was bought by the museum. Here was a case where the busy, preoccupied Sargent had gone out of his way to persuade the officers of the museum to purchase a picture by a relatively obscure man, for unquestionably it was his advice that had led to their action. But never a word did Sargent say to Tompkins or to anyone else about his part in the transaction, and it was only by accident, some time afterward, that Tompkins learned how it all came about. Painters and students of painting will be interested in an account of Sargent's method of making a head. Mr. John Collier, some years ago, in a lecture before the Society of Arts, made public the notes that one of Sargent's pupils had taken. Briefly, there was first a careful drawing of the masses, together with the correct placing of the subject on the canvas, with spots giving the exact location of the features. Then, with a large brush, and with plenty of paint, the tone and colour of the background were put in, the background being allowed to overlap the borders of the portrait. Next, a kind of middle tone was painted over the whole flesh space, light on the light side and dark on the dark, the tone being painted right into the background, background into flesh, and vice versa, until the effect of blending or melting of the one into the other was obtained. There were yet no features. Finally, for the first day's work, the broad tones, in which might be said to reside the features, were painted into the big middle tone while it was wet, and care was again taken to have colour, tone, and drawing right, and to observe subtly the various relations in tone of the darks and lights. Later on, after this painting was dry, it was oiled out, and the ground was gone over again much in the same way, the values of the underpainting being retained by thin rework over it. To this description of the painter's practice, another student added the further remark that at the end of the day, everything was brushed together while the paint was still wet, so as to get rid of the sharp edges, an approximation to Frans Hals's indeterminate blur. And finally, we hope you enjoyed this presentation of the remarkable John Singer Sargent. We focused on just a small portion of his great output, so give a like if you will, and thank you. Until next time. If you would, remember to leave a like. Mr. Sargent will be back again, and thank you.